Hello everybody, it is June 26, 2025 here in the United States of America. I'm making a video much earlier in the day than I normally do. I wasn't able to make one yesterday because I had an issue with the water line in my kitchen, which thank God that's fixed, and we can use our kitchen sink once more. And then also today I have to take my car into the dealership to get fixed. Thank God I purchased an extended warranty on it. It doesn't have that many miles on it. Thank you, American car companies, for producing such amazing and reliable vehicles these days. Gee whiz, I'm thrilled. Now, anywho, what I wanted to talk about today is the outcome of the Israeli-Iranian conflict and what I think actually happened behind the scenes and why the war was ended. And I want to talk about the nature of American involvement in this war. The entire thing seems to be a bit strange. No one can seem to figure out exactly why this war unfolded the way that it did and why it ended the way that it did and what actually happened. What we're being told by the media, generally speaking, is not true. It's propaganda for either side, and I'm not saying it's just American media. I'm sure Iranian media or more neutral media or media that leans away from the U.S. would probably also underplay things on the Iranian side as well. It's just a habit. People have their biases. So I want to talk about what I think actually took place from an unbiased perspective. So everyone knows, I'm sure by now, that Israel launched an attempted decapitation strike against Iranian military leadership, its nuclear program, and against its some of its top nuclear scientists. Now, the initial salvo was very successful. Several prominent members of the Iranian military were killed. Well, quite a few actually. Nuclear sites were damaged, and a few Iranian scientists were also killed in these strikes. Now, I think the assumption was by the Israelis that if these attacks were launched, that they could easily take out the upper echelons of the Iranian government, and then the country would fall into chaos and revolution shortly thereafter. Once the Ayatollah's government was crippled, then the Iranian regime would come crashing down like a house of cards. That is not what happened. The Iranians were able to fairly quickly recover and launch fairly destructive, if not devastating, salvos back towards Israel, overwhelming the Iron Dome. Iran used their advanced hypersonic missiles, and the videos are out there, and it is pretty clear that they were able to strike quite a few targets and hit certain places in Israel at will, while Israel carried out airstrikes over Tehran and continued to kill members of the Iranian military and damage Iranian infrastructure. Shortly into the war, the United States decided to get involved on Iran's behalf and launched an airstrikes against several Iranian nuclear sites using Tomahawk missiles and B-2 bombers. Now, this involvement was very strange. The Iranians were given notice of it. They were able to evacuate these sites, and the Iranian government was assured that this was a one-off strike, and the United States did not intend to get involved in the war long term and did not want to be involved in it. Now, I find that very strange. This seemed to be a symbolic act, not a real act of war meant to actually cripple the enemy. This was a display of power, and I believe this strike was more political than anything else. So here's what I think actually took place. And a couple days later, the ceasefire was proposed and signed. This is what I actually think happened in this war. This is my take on it. I could be totally wrong. There's a lot of analysis out there that was very emotionally driven at the time. I think it's best to stay away from that and to take a step back, try to put your biases to the side, and analyze the situation for what it really is. Here's what I think happened. I do firmly believe that the Israeli government did not give President Donald Trump a sufficient heads-up or warning on what they actually planned to do. Reports indicate there were actually arguments between President Donald Trump and Benjamin Netanyahu over the strikes, where Netanyahu, I guess, had told President Trump they were going to militarily intervene before Iran got the bomb. This was during negotiations between the United States and Israel. There were arguments about this where the United States told Iran, where the U.S. government, specifically President Trump, was telling the Israelis not to go through with the strikes to allow negotiations to play out. Israel flat out refused. They were talked down a bit. The strikes were actually meant to be much more extensive, and the Ayatollah was apparently meant to be targeted as well. They were going to assassinate the leader of a sovereign nation in the opening salvo of what would be a war. Now, generally speaking, this is a line that most countries don't want to cross. It's a precedent most countries don't want to set because it puts all leaders in the crosshairs and makes this practice the norm and fair game. So, and it's something extremely inflammatory that would probably have incited a massive regional war. It's a good thing it didn't, because the Israeli government vastly underestimated the capabilities of the Iranians. And I do believe when the Iranians began to launch these missile salvos back, they did much more damage than the Israelis intended. The Iron Dome was much less effective than the Israelis believed that it would be, and Iranian hypersonic missile technology is much better than the Israelis counted on, and quite a bit of damage was done. And Israel doesn't have a lot of places to hide things. It's not a large nation. It's smaller than New Jersey. They don't have a very in-depth defense, so to speak. Iran is twice the size of Texas, and there's plenty of mountainous terrain to hide military equipment. Israel doesn't have that advantage. They also don't have the numbers to fight a war of attrition. Israel's wars need to be fast, they need to be decisive, and they need to be over quickly. This war was not going to be over quickly. As a matter of fact, if this war had continued for several more weeks, I think Israel would have found itself in a very precarious predicament insofar as the amount of munitions they had readily available to use against Iran. I think Iran could fight a war much longer than Israel could. I think Israel began to realize this pretty quickly, which is why they begged so much for American involvement. Now, that put President Trump in a very iffy political situation. Now, as I mentioned before, it would appear that Netanyahu carried these strikes out against Trump's wishes. Now, Trump doesn't want to appear that the leader of a much smaller, less powerful country went against his wishes and perhaps deceived him. So I think that President Trump, after these strikes were carried out, decided to play along with them to save face, to preserve, to tamp down public resentment against Israel, because many people that voted for Trump would be quite upset if it was readily apparent that the Israeli government deceived President Trump and carried out these strikes against his wishes. So I believe that President Trump, after the fact, made it appear that, well, he knew all along these were coming. He was involved in these strikes, yada, yada, yada. The negotiations were a ruse. I don't think that's entirely true at all. I think there's a lot of friction behind the scenes between President Trump and Benjamin Netanyahu's government. There was an issue a few weeks ago where diplomatic relations, not between the two countries, but relations between President Trump and Benjamin Netanyahu took a very southward turn. A member of Trump's inner circle was fired, apparently, for working with the Israelis behind his back. This idea that the U.S. government is completely subservient to Israel, I don't think is entirely true. I think the United States government still has its own agency, so to speak, and I think there is quite a bit of pushback against Israel's influence in the American presidency, partly because often Israel's wishes go against the best interests of the U.S. Against the United States, and oftentimes too would clash with public opinion as well. When it appeared that President Trump was going to get directly involved in this war, there was a massive backlash from his base against him for the apparent decision that he had made to get involved in this war. Enough of a backlash, in fact, that it could have put the midterms in jeopardy and jeopardized the future of the Republican Party. Some people in the MAGA movement the more neocon leaning people in the MAGA movement discounted this, like, oh, they're just fear mongering. We don't need these people anyways. They weren't true MAGA. Listen, when 20 to 30, maybe 40% of your movement isn't happy with the decisions being made by its leader and are threatening to stay home at the polls, that's devastating, no matter what way anyone can cut it. And one of the things that President Trump ran on was no more foreign wars, no involvement in foreign wars. Americans are traumatized from foreign involvement. We want no part of it. From Korea to Vietnam to Iraq, Afghanistan, Americans are sick and tired of being involved in foreign wars. There's a reason why there's so much regret and anger within the ranks of our military and veterans. They feel like they're used, they feel like they're lied to, they feel like they're used to fight other countries' wars. They're watching their friends die, they're being maimed, they're coming back with PTSD, all for essentially nothing. I'm not saying they didn't fight for anything, but a lot of veterans have articulated their feelings about the past several wars that we've been involved in, and they feel like they fought for nothing. They fought for the man next to them, as most people in the military do. You fight for your friends, you fight to stay alive, you fight to get home to your family. But the political reasons for being there, I think most people now knew were misguided, if not outright wrong, and led to much more, led to a lot of unnecessary death and destruction. So there's a lot of resentment towards getting involved in any more foreign wars within Trump's voter base, and Trump knows this. So this whole situation was pretty precarious for Trump, and I think he wanted this war to end as quickly as possible. When it was clear that the Israelis couldn't end the war quickly and desperately needed American involvement, I think what happened behind the scenes was that President Trump decided to do a symbolic strike against the Iranians to satisfy the Israelis, for the American government to say, hey, at least we tried, we got involved in this, we used our air power, look, see, we're supporting you. Don't do anything rash or overly provocative to try to end this war. We're getting involved. Just wait, just watch. But the Iranians were told ahead of time that this attack was not meant to be long-term direct American involvement, that it was a one-off, and that America didn't intend to strike any more places within Iran. Now, I find that kind of strange. If you're involved in a war, the objective is usually to kill or cripple the enemy and win the war. The strike wasn't meant to do any of that. I think it was mostly symbolic and political in nature. Now, the American airstrikes are reported to have been, by some people, very successful, and this crippled the Iranian nuclear program. Some reports indicate that it wasn't actually successful, and the Iranian nuclear program is still fully capable of enriching uranium. It's hard to say which side is true. There's a lot of propaganda, a lot of bias around the reporting of this conflict, and it's best just to wait and see what happens. Now, shortly thereafter, the Iranians declared that they would retaliate. Now, and this is again another interesting part, the base that was targeted was a base in Qatar, or Qatar, as I work with a man that moved from Saudi Arabia when he was 18, and he was telling me how to properly pronounce names of Middle Eastern countries, and me and another friend of mine couldn't seem to figure out how to pronounce Qatar, and he told us that it's Qatar. Close enough. I don't know. Amir, I hope I got that right. Anyways, the base, Qatar was told ahead of time what base would be struck, and that Iran intended to strike this base, and American officials were given a heads up. Now, Iran didn't actually use hypersonic missiles against this base. They used less advanced ballistic missiles that were all intercepted, I think, with the exception of one. So again, this was another symbolic act that wasn't really meant to kill anybody. It was, of course, Iran, when they're in that position, they have to retaliate once struck, or they look weak. And shortly thereafter, the ceasefire was proposed, and both parties accepted it. I find this whole thing very strange. I and this is just to sum up what I think happened. The Israelis, I don't want to make this a super long video. I hate doing 20-minute plus videos. I think people find that uninteresting. They want a video that's straight to the point. Sometimes I kind of meander around a little bit. I know that. So what I think happened, just to sum this whole conflict up, Israel became impatient with the negotiations between the United States and Iran, decided to act quickly and rashly and foolishly, and against Trump's wishes, struck Iranian targets. Now Trump, frustrated as he is with Israel, isn't one to jeopardize their alliance publicly and to try to save face, pretended like he knew these strikes were coming all along, approved of them, and went along with them. I don't think he wanted to look like he was subordinate to Bibi Netanyahu and not in control of the situation. Now, when it was clear that these strikes did not cripple the Iranian regime, I think Israel then at that point began to beg for direct American involvement. Now, Trump knew that he could not afford politically to get involved directly in another Middle East war. It would be a disaster for the Republican Party and a disaster for his presidency. That is one of the main things he ran on. And there was a lot of anger and a lot of pushback from his anti-war base. Now, a pretty large portion of Trump's voters are flat-out anti-war. They're former progressives or libertarians, and they really held his feet to the fire over this. Now, I think it might have been better for some people to kind of wait and see what happens before becoming very emotional about things. There's quite a bit of catastrophizing about this from quite a few people in the MAGA movement. Oh, it's over. Trump has betrayed us. Israel tells him what to do. Our country's bought and sold. All is lost. I give up. Yada, yada, yada. Well, then it turns out behind the scenes that there actually is trouble in paradise, and that the Israelis and President Trump aren't exactly seeing eye to eye on things. So maybe it's best to let things play out before anybody makes rash judgments on things. Now, anyways, Trump couldn't politically afford this, but he also had to try to save face and also flex American muscle to try to maybe satisfy the Israelis, show the Iranians the Americans were serious, and then perhaps a ceasefire can be found, or a ceasefire can be declared before this conflict spirals into a regional catastrophe, where, if not a world catastrophe, where millions of people end up being killed. So I believe that a target was chosen. The Iranians were warned. Trump is very careful about letting the Iranians know, like, hey, this is basically a political act. This is symbolic. This is to save face and satisfy the Israelis. You're getting a heads up on this. It's not a surprise attack. It's not meant to kill anyone in Iranian leadership. We don't want any further involvement. So here you go. The mission was carried out against these sites. Damage was done. The Americans went home. The Iranians, again, have to retaliate. They can't look weak either. The Iranian leadership then chose an American base. Americans were given a heads up. They fired some missiles at it. The missiles were shot down, and then a ceasefire was declared. So essentially, what I think happened, to sum it up, Israel bit off a bit more than it could chew. The Iranian attacks were doing much, much more damage than Israel wanted to admit. The war was going to be a long war of attrition. Israel can't afford that. It doesn't have the manpower to do that. It doesn't have the equipment and munitions to do that. It's a much smaller country. Its terrain is much harder to defend. It's harder to hide things in Israel. The public was already unhappy with the direction that Benjamin Netanyahu has been taking the country. I think Israelis were shocked by the amount of damage the Iranians could do. Israel needed an off-ramp or direct U.S. involvement. The U.S. symbolically became involved, but made it clear that no further involvement and no direct war would be fought on Israel's behalf. And then a ceasefire was proposed as an off-ramp for Israel, the United States, and Iran to pull them to get themselves out of this situation. The Iranians declared victory. They saved face in the Arab world. The United States and Israel claimed the nuclear program was destroyed. They saved face and claimed victory, and now we go back to hopefully negotiations and no more long-term conflict in the region. Now, Iran has declared that they will still plan on continuing the enrichment of uranium, which I'm sure that's not going to stand with the Israelis, but the Israelis are not in a situation where they can start another war against Iran, especially if they know that the U.S. cannot politically afford to get directly involved in the conflict, at least with President Donald Trump in office. So I think the Israelis are going to revert back to assassinations and espionage and no open acts of war, while the U.S. hopes to return to negotiations with the Iranian government to work out some kind of nuclear deal, because I think Trump's long-term goal is to completely detach the United States from the Middle East and not to be involved in the region at all, because the mere fact that we're involved in the region tends to invite conflict, and I think President Trump is aware of that and genuinely wants the United States out of the region, but to do so, a general peace between all countries needs to be established. There needs to be some kind of nuclear deal with Iran. Israel and Iran need to stop fighting each other, and there needs to be some kind of peace accord between all nations. Again, I saw the Abraham Accords being brought back as the Abraham Alliance, and but one issue that I see is, while the Gaza conflict continues, I don't see any kind of diplomatic détente between Israel and its Arab neighbors until the conflict is concluded in a way that ends with the Palestinians not being forcefully expelled from their land. And also, I think while Benjamin Netanyahu is in office, the Arab nations aren't going to want to make any kind of true diplomatic outreach or reach some kind of peace agreement. Well, not peace agreement, but some kind of like a new framework. No one's going to want to create some kind of new framework with Israel while Benjamin Netanyahu is in office. Again, if anyone's watching this that supports Netanyahu, this is just true. I think Arab leaders are very unhappy with the Israeli government at the moment, and I don't see any kind of new agreement being reached with Arab governments while Netanyahu is currently in office. Now, I don't think he's going to stay in office much longer. I think he's ran his course in Israeli politics and will probably be exiting fairly soon. But I don't want to stretch this video out any further. This is generally what I think happened in this war. I think Israel couldn't afford to fight a long conflict, knew it. The war was going to go on much longer than they anticipated. They needed to get out of it. America needed to save face and show strong support for its ally. And Iran also would probably have preferred not to fight a long and protracted war and rebuild its own infrastructure, even though they were better prepared for it than Israel. I think they wanted out as well before things really spiraled out of hand, and thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people ended up being killed. But anyways, that's all I wanted to talk about today. I'll be back with another video Saturday, so I will see everybody then.